It's Monday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. How will the assassination attempt on Donald Trump change American politics? As the Republican convention gets underway in Milwaukee, President Biden appeals for unity.
We can't allow this violence to be normalized. You know, the political record in this country has gotten very heated. It's time to cool it down.
Donald Trump has just arrived at the convention where he'll be joined by his ally, Reform UK leader Nigel Farage.
The narrative that is put out there about Trump by these liberals that oppose him is so nasty, is so unpleasant, that I think it almost encourages this type of behaviour.
And this from the Culture Secretary amidst warnings about the security of politicians here.
It is part of a wider toxicity of politics. We've just been through the general election here in the UK. It is the most toxic election that I can ever remember participating in.
And after more deaths in the Channel, will Labour's plans reduce small boat crossings? Joining us today is the Labour MP for Dover and Deal, Mike Tapp, Tees Valley Mayor and Conservative peer Ben Houchin, Tribune magazine columnist Grace Blakely and Telegraph columnist Zoe Strimple. This is Politics Live. Well, after all of that build-up and then the crushing disappointment yesterday, we can see the England team. They've left their hotel in Berlin after that rather devastating loss to Spain in the Euros final. Fans there to wave them off amidst ongoing discussions about the decisions made, some of them about the team choices by the manager Gareth Southgate during the tournament. There he is there, leaving with the team. We didn't win, but what, if anything, Mike, can politicians learn about the leadership from Gareth Southgate?
Well, I think he was really under the cosh for the whole tournament. But we saw a leader who stuck to his strategy and took us to the very end, just 4 minutes out from going into extra time. So sticking to a strategy and holding firm, I think.
What did you think, Ben? Anything to learn from Gareth Southgate and his style of leadership and management?
I think so, more in the medium term. I mean, people have to remember where we were when we got knocked out by Iceland, the culture of the team, lots of factions. And I think one of the things that a leader can do is set the culture of an organisation. So I think he did that. But also, as we see in politics as well as everything else, things come to a natural end, don't they? And we need a fresh start, I think. And I think he's done an incredible job. And I think hopefully whoever comes in the future, because we don't know what he's going to do we? But I think if whoever comes in the future can build on that culture that he's built over the last 8 years.
Is that what happened to your party? Things just came to a natural end?
Yeah, well, I mean, there are some synergies there, right? I mean, we need a fresh start, we need some new ideas. But again, it starts from the top. So who ultimately is ever leader is going to set that culture. Any
read across in terms of the leadership, things that we can learn in politics?
I think that Southgate shows us that leadership has a lot to do with creating kind of solidarity and unity out of diversity. And he did a very good job of that.
Zoe?
I liked Southgate's seriousness. I think that's something that we don't necessarily see in our politicians and in our political culture. A kind of head down, as you say, kind of sticking to a strategy. I also think psychologically he has interesting sort of lessons and strength to offer because he was operating against the great British declinism narrative and the kind of overwhelming need to be just like painful and bad and decline. And basically he changed that around. OK, in the end, he paid his final homage to British declinism by making sure we didn't ultimately win. But I think there was a kind of, politicians also are operating against, leaders are also operating against very powerful narratives of decline. So.
All right. Well, let's take a look at American politics and show you the shocking moment. A gunman opened fire at Donald Trump, who was addressing a rally in Pennsylvania at the weekend.
Take a look at what happened.
Well, as Donald Trump was taken off the stage, I mean, his reaction was actually one of defiance. One member of the audience was killed and 2 others injured. The gunman himself was also shot dead. Let's have a listen to President Joe Biden, how he reacted overnight.
My fellow Americans, I want to speak to you tonight about the need for us to lower the temperature in our politics. And to remember, while we may disagree, we are not enemies. We're neighbors, we're friends, co-workers, citizens, and most importantly, we're our fellow Americans. We must stand together. Yesterday's shooting at Donald Trump's rally in Pennsylvania calls on all of us to take a step back. Take stock of where we are, how we go forward from here. Thankfully, former Trump is not seriously injured. I spoke with him last night. I'm grateful. He's doing well, and Jill and I keep him and his family in our prayers.
President Joe Biden addressing the nation there. Let's talk to CBS News correspondent Sabrina Francer, who's at the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee. Sabrina, what are the political implications of what happened to Donald Trump?
Well, it is really interesting. As soon as those photos came out, that video that has been really played on repeat across the country in the past 48 hours, you could hear the former president when he lifts his fist in the air. He says what seems to be the word fight, and that is almost a rallying cry that the Republicans, those who support the former president in his bid for re-election, have begun to use in their posts of support, whether they be on social media or chants we expect to hear outside of the convention in the next 4 days.
Is it going to be a galvanizing moment then, do you think, for Donald Trump?
It does seem a little bit, the energy, at least here, feels like a comeback in a way. We know that the former president had at one point thought that he might delay his trip to Milwaukee, where the Republican convention is being held here, by 2 days because he had just been shot. Those plans were tossed. The former president did land in Milwaukee yesterday. His presidential motorcade drove through the streets of the city as he made his way to the hotel where he'll be staying for the week. And he did that in part because he said he did not want the shooter's actions to deter any of the scheduled events that were already planned for this week. The convention is going on as planned. There have been no changes to the line of events over the next 4 days, a quite lengthy list of different things happening both in the convention center where we're standing right now, but also in 2 other facilities that are neighboring this building. So that's all staying the same. There is a different mood than there might have been had this not happened. There's a little bit more of a tense energy in the air. You can kind of feel the weight of what has happened lingering over the convention. But in terms of thinking of what the reaction might be when the former president takes the stage and eventually accepts his nomination, you can only predict that will be some sort of celebration from his supporters.
All right, Sabrina Francer, thank you very much. Let's talk to the chairman of Republicans Overseas UK, Greg Swenson. I'm sure there is tense energy there at the National Convention. You are there too. What did you think? What was your reaction when you saw the footage of the assassination attempt?
Well, my reaction was relief, because by the time I was able to see any footage, I'd already understood that he was safe and not critically injured, and the assassination attempt had failed. However, when I heard the news initially, I had just landed at O'Hare International here in Chicago, so I didn't have a television in front of me, but I had many text messages and phone calls. So of course everybody was shocked, but then 10 or so minutes later, relieved that he was okay. But I think Sabrina brought, I think she described it well. There's a tense energy here. People are, by the time we all arrived or started trickling in yesterday, Sunday afternoon, the news was good, and the initial shock was 24 hours old. But I think that there is a real energy level here. I think it ends up elevating the energy. People are, in a very positive way, fired up, again, relieved that it wasn't worse, saddened by the loss of Corey Comparatore, a brave fireman who was protecting his family.
Yes.
So that's really put a bit of a downer on the whole energy here. But other than that, I think it's real positive, and I imagine President Trump will get quite the welcome when he appears.
Right. I mean, we've just heard some of what President Joe Biden said in terms of calling for unity, in terms of trying to de-escalate, cool the situation down. But we also saw pictures of that rather instinctive reaction from Donald Trump punching the air and saying, fight. And there are Republicans, some of them, who have said this is the fault of liberals. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't think we can really, connect the dots there to this kind of lone wolf gunman. Yes, he might have been influenced by social media or by some of the hatred from the left and even some of the, provocative language from Joe Biden. But I say might. It's hard to really, assure that. Now, President Trump, yelling the words "fight." I mean, that's not literally fight. That's a metaphor. I mean, he was just saying, as he's been saying in the campaign and really been saying for 8 years that, the voters should fight back against, the government encroaching on their freedoms and their lifestyles or whatever. And so I think that was, just a way to reassure the people at the rally that he was okay.
Right.
And I think he did a good job with that.
Well, let me just show you this tweet from Senator J.D. Vance, possibly a potential running mate for Donald Trump. He says, today is not just some isolated incident, obviously referring to the shooting. The central premise of the Biden campaign is that President Donald Trump is an authoritarian fascist who must be stopped at all costs. That rhetoric led directly to President Trump's attempted assassination. Is he right?
Not with the word directly. You can speculate, and I think there is a lot of that discussion going on both sides of the aisle right now. But to say direct, I mean, might be a little bit too confident when there is, at least for now, no direct connection. But I do think that it was wise for President Biden to do the speech last night from the Oval Office. I thought it was wise that he left his beach house in Delaware on Saturday after the news and returned to the White House. And I thought the speech last night was well written. I don't think he delivered it particularly well, but he's had difficulty delivering speeches, for the last several years and especially the last several months.
All right.
But I think the content was well done.
OK, Greg, stay with us for the discussion here in the studio. Zoe, your response, first of all, to the J.D. Vance tweet, and even Greg saying not directly as a result of some of the rhetoric, but maybe indirectly.
I mean, maybe indirectly, but here I have to agree with Greg's caution about connecting dots. I think people, Robert Putnam did an interview recently in the New York Times, the author of Bowling Alone, and this thesis of people being ever more isolated in their online worlds, and who knows what is being beamed straight to them. So I think it's very hard, given such a fractured, atomized online culture, which attracts, as we know, lonely young men. It's very hard to piece together any kind of collective discourse that will have influenced him. We don't even know, so I would have to agree with that. I think there's also different cultures of political violence. Both right and left have histories of political violence. Assassination attempts on presidents, certainly have happened successfully before in the US. So, given that longer history, there may be some sort of maybe the sort of tradition was emerging through this particular lone wolf. But yeah, I don't think that kind of J.D. Vance rhetoric would have caused it.
I mean, Grace, many Republicans do and have criticised left-wing media for also, in their minds, contributing to the sort of culture that this happens in.
Yeah, look, we obviously don't know what the individual motivations of this man were, but we do know that this has taken place in the context of the militarization of American politics and society more generally. We've seen, there have been significant problems in the US of kind of domestic, homegrown terrorists, basically, the vast majority of whom who have committed violent crimes have come from the extreme right, who are often radicalized online by conspiracy theories such as the Great Replacement. And wherever they are from on the political spectrum, the militarization comes from the conclusion they've drawn, which is that we cannot achieve our political aims through democracy. We have to go outside of democracy, we have to use violence, and that is something that is very, very concerning and threatening to basic democratic norms, particularly in the US, where you do have the addition of obviously lots of firearms, but also all over the world.
Right. What we haven't talked about perhaps are the divisions, but in America and to some extent across Europe and here too. But what was your reaction when you saw what had happened?
Well, I absolutely agree. I think social media in particular has a huge role to play in this. It's the atomization of how people interact in the world. Is an issue about how people are communicated to, because people are self-reinforced by finding their own little bubbles. I mean, I'm interested in Greg's particular opinion, particularly around the discourse between the Democrats and the Republicans, as to whether this is kind of a pox on all of your houses, in that everybody's to blame. I think it's much more polarised in America than it is here. I worry that we're getting slightly further down that journey as a UK generally. But I think if you look at what the Democrats have done, they have tried to talk about Trump being undemocratic. But again, I think it's fair to say, Joe, you've probably covered it in the last few years, Trump has also been through his own controversies in recent years.
Yeah, and the Capitol riots, of course.
All of those things. So it kind of feels to me like this is not necessarily the responsibility of one individual or any one party, but a general discourse in America that is getting more and more polarised, which I think we're seeing the polarisation accelerate because of social media platforms that have algorithms that get people to be able to self-reinforce existing viewpoints, and then I think you can accelerate towards extremism.
One thought, though, which is that Trump himself is an incredibly extreme figure, like by word and by deed. And I think, frankly, there's some of the descriptions that are attached to him and deemed extreme are actually literal, accurate descriptions of him and what he's said. So I think it's this bizarre thing which we don't have in the UK.
When you say that, what do you mean exactly?
Well, I think, he has talked about, he doesn't exactly reassure one that he'll be happy to, give a democratically...
Accept the result.
He didn't accept the result.
No.
How are things going to end in 4 years' time?
I also think there's something really powerful that could happen at the convention, whether he does it or not. This is Donald Trump, right? But I think if Donald Trump came out and took a much more statesman-like kind of coming together view and tried to bring the country together, I think it could be very powerful for him politically. Whether he's able to take that is a very different thing, because it's Donald Trump.
But what do you say, Greg, just listening to the discussion here, particularly the point that Donald Trump himself does use language that is inflammatory, didn't accept the result of the last contest in terms of the presidential election, and then can that lead to people thinking we'll resort to undemocratic means?
No, I don't think so. I mean, yes, President Trump is clumsy with some of his comments and unfiltered.
Clumsy.
I guess that's an understatement. Yeah. But look, I mean, people take it sometimes too literally. I try to look at what Trump says versus what he does, and also what he says versus what the press says he said. But I think what he does is concentrate on effective policy. I'm not, campaigning for him. I'm just suggesting that people miss the peace and prosperity of 2020. And if he says some silly things, so be it. And on the other side, you remember, President Biden ran as a unifier and as someone in 2020 to bring back normalcy and get away from the chaos. And he's completely failed on those metrics, between the demagoguery, the MAGA hate, the MAGA speeches, the radical policies that have really hurt working Americans, whether it's the electric vehicle mandates or boys using girls' bathrooms, or crushing the energy sector, which has inflated petrol prices by 25%, and relieving student loans and basically transferring student loans to taxpayers. Those are things that are divisive by nature.
You're making the platforms absolutely clear. But Mike, what's your reaction listening to this debate? Is it enough to say that Donald Trump has said silly, clumsy things in the past? And does Joe Biden have to take some responsibility too on behalf of the Democrats?
I think Donald Trump's reaction, when he's just been shot at, fight, was quite understandable in that moment. What we'd like to see going forward is obviously that politics of unity, and now opportunities for that. We've seen that from Joe Biden, and then domestically in the UK, we've obviously seen that from our leaders here. And, we always try and draw these comparisons between US and British politics, but over here we've just had our political system tested, and we've had that peaceful transference of power. Obviously, there was some toxicity behind the scenes that we need to take very seriously, and we are going to, Yvette Cooper's spoken about that, as has Lisa.
Well, we're going to talk about that in just a moment. Let me just show you this, Grace, the Daily Telegraph headline: "I'm flying to America to support Trump in this desperate hour. He's had a narrow miss. It's a miracle. I implore the left to think very carefully about how they seek to play politics."
Well, look, I think it's very important at times like this to draw a very clear line between divisive politics, which is something that is created by, divisions within society. They're not things that we can just get rid of by saying use more civil language. We live in a very divided era. And then actual threats of and organisation of violence, which veers towards basically fascism. When you say we cannot achieve our political ends through democracy, we have to use violent extra-parliamentary means to achieve those ends, that leads you down a very dangerous road. Politics is, of course, going to be divided, and politicians are, as we've just heard, going to say that is down to the real divisions that exist in the country, and I think that is, something that is unavoidable. But we have to make this very clear distinction between divided politics, politicians arguing with one another, and then people who go out and threaten violence and use extra democratic means to achieve their aims.
Also, there's something a bit disingenuous about Farage here. I mean, come on, this is not a desperate hour. This is fantastic for Trump. He's going to win. Like, we all know that basically, I keep making the comparison to what happened to poor Salman Rushdie when he was on stage. The wounds he sustained put him out. He was going to die for 3 months. Sure. Trump has escaped. It's obviously, as Grace says, we can't have a society where political violence is acceptable at all. In this particular case, because Trump has survived and he's safe, this is a huge triumph.
So
for him
someone was
politically.
killed, and I think that needs to be front and centre of this conversation. Yeah, it's really sad. That's
very, very sad. But what Farage
killed,
is referring to is the implication here is that Trump himself is now in the kind of uniquely stressful, embattled, dangerous, unfairly perilous situation, and that seems disingenuous to me.
I don't know whether we've still got Greg, but I just want to go back to this point about how important I think Donald Trump's address to the Republican convention is going to be, because I think it can really set the direction of travel. We could see, I think, further division. I mean, the old school Trump, who is quite clumsy with his language, as Greg has rightly said, and some of the things he comes out with could absolutely make things worse. But again, I absolutely agree with you. I think he's already in a very strong place. I think this unifies the Republican base even more. But if he gets this right and draws a more conciliatory tone, I don't know whether he's likely to do that in the Republican convention. I don't know whether we've got any inclination as to whether that might happen.
Are you hoping he'll calm things down, Greg?
Yes, he's already indicated, Trump has already decided to rewrite his speech or, work with his speechwriters to rewrite the speech. But it will not be as originally planned. It will be much more of a unifying message and a positive message about the future. And that he's already telegraphed. So that's good news. And I think that, he's been much more disciplined in general in this campaign versus 16 and 20, in spite of taking a lot of hits with the indictments and the lawsuits and the impeachments, the Hillary Clinton, election denying, that started the whole, tailspin, in my view, saying that, he was an illegitimate president and he didn't really win. This ended up being an election loser when Trump and many of his supporters were denying the 2020 election, and they got to the midterms in 22, and that really hurt him. So I think he's learned his lessons, and I think he'll be much more disciplined this Thursday.
Greg Swenson, thank you very much for joining us. Let's bring the discussion to MP safety here. This BBC News headline, MP safety keeps me awake at night, says the Speaker. This is Sir Lindsay Hoyle talking to BBC Radio 4's Westminster Hour, saying he had never seen anything as bad as the current level of intimidation against MPs. You're a new MP. It's the first time. How are you feeling about the level of intimidation that clearly many candidates experienced?
I was quite lucky in my campaign that it wasn't particularly toxic and we felt quite safe. But I've spoken to my colleagues who are newly elected, but also existing MPs who have felt scared. And that's absolutely unacceptable, whether it's harassment, threats, intimidation, or even antisocial behaviour that we're seeing now on the streets around this. Some of these political arguments that are crossing over and politicians are worried. But we're taking this very seriously. Dan Jarvis and Yvette Cooper are already looking at this. They're reaching out across the House to ensure that we've got a full picture so we can assess the threat that we saw throughout the last election campaign, and we'll certainly be putting in sensible measures to protect all MPs.
Well, this is a letter that's been written to the new Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, by Lord Walney, who is the government's advisor on political violence. And he has written, election abuse may have been coordinated, a concerted campaign, he writes, by extremists to create a hostile atmosphere for MPs within their constituencies to compel them to cave into political demands. What's your response, Grace?
I think, again, we have to be very careful at drawing a fine line between divisive language and then threats of physical violence and intimidation. I've been doing stuff like this. I've been in the public eye since I was about 23. And in that time, the last kind of 7-8 years, I've received a lot of abuse, a lot of kind of, intimidating language, a lot of, horrible things online and in person.
But is that, should that be tolerated?
Well, look, when I've received threats, I've sent those to the police, and the police have kind of have dealt with those. There is a general trend of kind of, abusive language towards women online and people in general in the political eye online. And I think that you have to be very careful and clear about what's motivating that, and don't try and undermine free speech and undermine democracy in the pursuit of trying to kind of shut that down, because it only strengthens the arguments of those people who say democracy doesn't work because they're shutting down free speech, we can't hold MPs to account, and so we have to take things outside of the normal democratic channels.
Right. But I think we know very well the difference between trying to hold an MP or a politician to account and the kinds of intimidatory actions and language that are being used. I mean, I'm not a politician, and I shudder to think what it's like to be a Jewish female MP, for instance. But just as a journalist with those characteristics, the language itself is there's no holding me to account. It's end yourself. It's you stink. It's the most violent language possible. And I think, as much as we do have laws to deal with incitement, there needs to be much closer, we need to figure out how to punish this kind of thing. And the police don't quite know how to do it, because they can't find the people who are doing it.
The point that you made there about the language that's used online, it is upsetting, and it makes you feel kind of like angry and scared often. But when it is not actually threatening, when it's not threats of violence, what I've learned is that you have to actually learn how to understand the context within which this is taking place. So, you can have people very angry at you, very angry at politicians who may have experienced something that you have no knowledge of. Someone who is extremely angry and upset online, whether that's because they've seen a family member die on an NHS waiting list, whether that's because they've seen a family member blown up in Gaza, or whether it's just because they're an angry young man who's isolated and alone and spends their time hurling abuse at people on the internet. We cannot stop that by criminalising it. We cannot stop that by shutting down debate. We have to actually address the issues that underlie those
That's
concerns.
impossible, though, because in the short term, people are having their lives destroyed. So I think you can't just have this kind of high principle idea of solving all social problems, because in the short term, the police need to know how to go after people
who use email addresses. When there's violent language, when there's harassment, when there's threats, absolutely, no question.
But the law is how we delineate that.
Well, exactly, right.
So hence criminalisation.
Of course, that's why we have rules, protecting free speech that have exceptions for violence.
Well, there's a difference between. I absolutely agree with what you're saying, Grace, but there's a difference between that and, for instance, we saw a sleuth of MPs standing down at the last election, in part because of the intimidation and the threats that they'd seen. I mean, I've been an elected politician as the regional mayor since 2017. I've had a number of death threats. I've had the police turn up at my door 9, 10 o'clock at night saying that there's a credible, immediate threat against my person. I've got a wife, I've got a young child. That is not something that we should allow in our discourse.
Absolutely.
The problem is, and it gets into a really nuanced debate then, is where is that line and what constitutes that threat? Now, the threats to me were very real. It was about cutting me up and all sorts of horrible things. But then there's very coarse behaviour. And then you're getting back into this echo chamber that is social media that then becomes a reinforcing mechanism, and then it drives more extremes because it drives more extreme behaviour.
One thing I've noticed, I'm glad you both raised this, is that females do tend to have it harder online, and that's absolutely unacceptable. But also, speaking with colleagues, we're talking policing here, there seems to be potentially some inconsistencies in approach across the country, and this is where Dan Jarvis and Yvette Cooper's input is going to be so important while they carry out this assessment and study.
But how are they going to distinguish between the two? Abuse, which is terrible anyway, but then real threats to people.
Abuse is a criminal offence in itself, and we've got to make sure that that's acted upon.
But I also don't think
so. It's ensuring that legislation's in place to be able to do that. But that's where it's so important that we conduct this assessment and this study first, and don't rush to any conclusions. Let's make sure this is an educated answer, and that's what Dan Jarvis.
So we've got the abuse part as well. But again, going back to just my personal circumstance, no action was taken,
and that's unacceptable.
And so even at the extreme end where there are threats, those actions are not taken. I mean, I've been in politics a while now, and hearing that MPs are now told to carry basically an alarm with them 24 hours a day. People having safe rooms installed in their house. That's only really come about, as I'm aware of, the last kind of 4 or 5 years.
It is only recent.
And leaders have a responsibility here to unite, and I'm really glad that you're invited to 10 Downing Street with Keir Starmer, so that we've got that cross-party approach, and we can take some of that tribalism and poison out of our politics.
There's another
That's up to
point
us
to this, which has come up here already, which is the free speech, and people are very cynical, and it's also a complicated thing of when people deploy, but it's just within the realms of free speech. And I've noticed that, for instance, with the campus protests against Israel's campaign in Gaza, suddenly the kind of brigade that had formerly wanted to no platform people, et cetera, are like, oh, but this is academic free speech. This is free speech. But if you go to these campuses, it's incredibly intimidating stuff, and there's also countless examples of brazen anti-Semitic threat, and yet somehow this is now being heralded as free speech.
Well, this is bad faith. Well, this is an interesting point, is it not? Because we have had to sit through years, basically, of the right saying free speech is very important. I have always agreed with that. Free speech is a cornerstone of our democracy. Now, what does free speech mean?
So you
is a liberal right
or anything like that?
What is free speech? Free speech is a liberal right that was guaranteed along with freedom of expression and association, which means you are free to express your beliefs without fear of punishment by the state. It is protection against criminalisation. Exactly, it's protection against protection against criminalisation from the state. So the state cannot throw you in jail for saying things, and that is something that is important.
At all.
No. But I mean, this is what we're talking about.
Let Mike answer. Is there a threat of chilling effect?
There's no suggestion of curtailing freedom of speech. Our democratic rights are based upon that.
And we all
exactly, which is very important.
But we know that's not what's at stake. It's only at stake.
This is why having Yvette Cooper and Dan Jarvis looking into this is so important. And they're very sensible, serious leaders who aren't going to rush to conclusions here. And
they're going to be busy because they've also got to sort this out. BBC News: 4 migrants die in English Channel crossing attempt. On Friday, it was reported that 4 migrants died after a boat capsized during an attempt to cross the English Channel. That was according to the French Coast Guard. Are Labour's Border Security Command plans really going to be able to put a stop to this?
It's a serious policy for a serious issue. We've seen from the Conservatives essentially pretty much open borders because they've relied on gimmicks and cons. They've tried to trick the electorate into thinking they've got a serious approach to this. We've seen the failure with record crossings. The Border Security Command will essentially hunt down the smuggling gangs, and we will be their worst nightmare. We'll bring in MI5, those extra powers and tools to smash the criminal gangs, to stop people even getting onto the boats in the first place. That's going to save lives, but also help us secure the borders.
Ben?
I mean, I hope the government is successful because we need to stop this from happening, not just because we want to try and limit illegal immigration, but actually there are people dying in the Channel, right? This is a human tragedy as well as anything else. So trying to get to a solution that works is important. I think, again, it goes a little bit back to the rhetoric. During the election, obviously we saw net migration at kind of 685,000 for the last year. But again, we were talking about small boats in the same breath. But actually, the small boats are only a very small fraction of that. We have about 100,000 applications a year for asylum seekers, of which about 4,000 or 5,000 tend to get leave to remain. And so when you actually break it down, we're trying to merge together legal migration, work, study, illegal immigration, small boats, and that goes towards... I don't think it was very clear from anybody of any political persuasion in the election campaign.
But did your party put too much emphasis on small boats, just reflecting what you have just said in terms of the numbers when we come to talk about legal migration versus illegal migration as deemed by the previous government? Was there too much emphasis on it?
Well, I think there is no silver bullet to it. So Rishi's plan for the Rwanda scheme to be able to act as that deterrent, he would say, and rightly so, that other European nations are now copying that.
But he said stop the boats. He was going to stop them.
Disingenuous cons and gimmicks, unfortunately.
So I want to get into the detail of it rather than going back to the cliches. So,
but was it wrong? That's important, isn't it? Because you talk about delivery. Yeah. And so was I will stop the boats the right way of approaching it?
Well, I think one of the reasons we lost the election was because around an issue of trust and competency, and by using such language of we are going to stop it full stop and we're not going to have a more adult conversation about the fact that we need to reduce it and here are the complexities. You know, there are lots of things that went wrong with the campaign, and some of those definite kind of pledges that were made make it difficult, and that really fed into a much wider conversation, which we might be getting on, around competency of the Conservative Party and the government to deliver on any of its pledges, of which immigration was an example of a lack of competency in being able to deliver it, in part because of the language used, but it doesn't get back to it doesn't get away from the fact that, irrespective of who's in government, and I do hope that the Labour government get to grips with this, but I think we all need to be grown up and say this kind of gold command, or sorry, I forget the term of it, is not going to be the panacea and the silver bullet.
It's a part of the...
Absolutely. But this is it. So it's the same in the election. It was Rwanda or command. Yes. And it's like, no, there's a much more long-term...
So bear in mind we're only 1 week in, so we're talking about first steps here.
But already there is an issue, Mike, because Labour's border force plan is set back as the top candidate. Neil Basu, the former national head of counter-terrorism, says no.
Well, Neil Basu came out and backed our plans in front of the TV cameras before the election, so we know he's behind this. He said he's not going to apply. We don't know the reasons for that, but we will be recruiting across the military, the intelligence services and policing. We'll get the top figure into that position.
Can Labour's intervention turn the tide on this issue?
No, and we know this because people don't leave their homes just because, you know, they feel like it. There are massive, significant factors that are driving them and pushing them out of the places that they come from, not least climate breakdown. Now, climate breakdown is going to create millions of climate refugees by 2050. The World Bank has said this, various different organisations have said this. And what we're seeing, you know, we've been talking about toxicity and divisiveness in politics. The response to that from many people across the political spectrum, but particularly from people like Nigel Farage and certain people in the Conservative Party with whom he has made alliances of convenience, their response to this is to demonise those people crossing the channel and say the reason you can't afford a home, the reason you can't get a job is because there are people coming into this country who don't deserve to be here. And that is wrong and doesn't get
But you think Labour's approach is wrong too?
Issue. Yeah, you know, I don't think that you are doing enough to address the factors that are pushing people out of their homes. Where is the plan on climate? Where is the plan on alleviating global poverty? Where's the plan on security?
Look, we have the first responsibility of any government is secure borders, and we make no apologies for that. But look, we've got really ambitious green plans to go fully renewable by 2030. That's world leading. And, you know, we can create a green economy off of the back of that with building British. We can then export that green economy like we did with the first industrial revolution. So, you know, we can't fix the world, the global climate problem, but we can do our part and show others and lead
with
from the front.
No investment and very little money, relying simply on the promise of economic growth that is never going to appear.
Is it about the green?
It's not about our green policy. That's not what's going to affect.
It's about green policy globally.
Well, no,
exactly.
it's about the fact that these people are living in insufferable countries full of, you know, despotism, war, bloodshed, you know, God knows what, no human rights. And there's some amount of economic migrancy. So for me, the whole debate is kind of compromised by the fact that there's never any serious talk about who we want to be here, not based on where they come from or what they look like, but what kind of person we want to be here. Okay, but there seems to be no mechanism by which to put that in place. So
but it's not
we should be able to send. We should be able to. We absolutely it is
because it's also about people who've been forced out of their homes through no fault of their own.
We have well, there's international law governing asylum. Okay, there's international rules governing how you can claim asylum. As Britain, we clearly have the right to decide who we want to stay here, who isn't already here, and that might be to do with the fact that they do not wish us harm. They want to work. We absolutely can decide that, and that's what we have to do. And it would be a much fairer way of looking at things, and it wouldn't be about demonizing people from other places. It would be about thinking about how is this going to help our culture be more dynamic.
You might say
but we have no way of distinguishing.
Qualified doctors, lawyers, university educated people from all over the world.
But that's our choice.
But the people who are being forced out of their homes, often because of conflicts within which we've been involved, because of issues like climate breakdown.
And on that, Grace, then, does that mean in your mind that this Labour government should say yes to anyone coming across on a Channel boat who has an asylum claim to make?
Of course not. We need to have a strategy that involves balancing migration, which is deeply beneficial to this country, with processing asylum claims from people who have been forced out of their homes, and balancing that with agreements that we are making with rich countries all over the world, because this is something that is not going to wait. It's going to get worse as climate breakdown
it's certainly not going to go away.
No, and beyond the first steps of securing the border, which we must do, we do have sensible policy in place for this. So we're going to revisit, reform those resettlement routes to make sure they're actually viable from those war-torn nations that do need that genuine refuge, but also on the, who do we let in argument, people aren't bad for wanting to come to this country, but we have to have a serious policy around that, and that's matching the jobs market with the immigration market, and that's what we'll be delivering.
All right, you said, Ben, that it was symbolic in part of why the Conservatives lost the election, certainly in terms of failure to deliver on policies that had been promised. Now, you warned against a protracted leadership debate and contest. However, a previous leader, former Conservative leader Sir Ian Duncan-Smith, has said the opposite. He says here in the Mail on Sunday, "I know from history there's nothing worse than rushing into a leadership election." What do you say to him?
Well, the interesting thing is nobody's actually set out a timeline. I don't think it should be particularly long, but I haven't said when that should be, and I don't think IDS has said the alternative. I think what I'm hearing within the Conservative Party is a natural timeline should probably be at some point in October, with the conference playing a significant role in a hustings or in that leadership debate to make sure that members can have a full and fulsome involvement in that. All I'm saying is there are some within the Conservative Party that are talking about taking out potentially to December. Now, the problem I have with that is, one, you can be accused of navel-gazing for too long as a Conservative Party instead of speaking to the country. Secondly, the vast majority, if not all of the leadership contenders, albeit not necessarily formally declared, we know who they are. They're well known, not just to the Conservative Party, but to most people. We all know roughly where they stand on the political spectrum of the Conservative Party. But there is a role for them to set out what the future agenda of the Conservative Party is. And if you go too long, you also get to a point, which is a very purely Conservative politics one, which is you can have too much bloodletting and you can have too much kind of dirty laundry aired out in public. And so I think there's a kind of a Goldilocks thing, right? Somewhere happy in the middle. And I think most people are coalescing around an October date for the announcement of a new leader.
Would you be against an interim, a sort of caretaker leader, perhaps like Ian Duncan-Smith?
Well, we need a leader of the Conservative Party. I mean, I'm not sure whether Rishi Sunak has decided what he's doing. I've heard suggestions that he might want to stand down sooner. I've not heard anything from him personally as to what he would do. But again, in the meantime, the other reason we can't wait too long to have a new leader of the Conservative Party is we do have to have an opposition in Parliament, and for Parliament to function properly, it needs to be scrutinised properly. As Keir Starmer said to me in Parliament, in Number 10 the other day, the best form of policy is one that survives scrutiny. And so the Conservative Party has an important democratic function to fulfil, which at the moment it can't fulfil until it gets itself through this process. I mean, an interim leader can do it in part, but an interim leader is just basically the shepherd going through the leadership contest until we find a permanent leader.
Zoe, can the Conservative Party put itself back together again?
Of course, anything's possible. I think
that was a big vote of confidence.
Anything. I think that the Conservative Party is currently in a state of disarray and paying a price that it sort of deserved to have to pay. So it can either use this period of chaos which I think it is doing, to kind of seriously rethink everything, to finally, now that they don't have to pretend that they're going to succeed in anything they say they're going to do, they can have honest conversations. It has to reform, and it has to decide how it wants to relate to Farage, and that to me is a worrying potential capitulation, and so but that seems to me like that's the new danger, that they're all sort of thinking, oh, maybe we should actually.
Well, what do you think? Live alongside reform, destroy reform, join with reform?
I think the reality is that is an argument that people are trying to manufacture. The people in the Conservative Party.
But what do you think? What do you think, Ben? How would you approach
I
reform?
personally think Reform are a completely separate party. Nigel Farage, I wouldn't welcome into the Conservative Party, if for no other reason he's just stood on a mandate to try and destroy the Conservative Party. Reform is not of the Conservative Party. And again, when I speak to MPs, when I speak to potential leadership contenders, nobody, other than with the odd exception, is talking about any sort of partnership or coalition with Reform. And what's really interesting, something that came out today, More in Common produced some data on the reasons voters didn't vote for the Conservative Party. And even Reform voters, only 13% said they didn't vote for us because we were too left-wing. This is an issue of trust and competency, not one of ideology.
Right, but could a candidate then on the right of the party, not joining with Reform, win an election for the Conservatives?
Yeah, absolutely. This idea that, we saw it with Jeremy Corbyn in 17 and 19, it was the end of the Labour Party. No doubt the media will want it as the Conservative Party. There is always a way back, as long as we want to be sensible about it.
That's all we have time for. Thank you to all of my guests for joining me today, and I'll be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at 12:15 here on BBC Two and the iPlayer. Bye.